Welcome on in, golf fans, and Happy New Year. First piece of content, first tournament of this PGA Tour actual calendar year. Not really of the season, but either way, excited to get back into golf after this extended break that we've had. And this week, we've got ourselves an absolute banger of an event. We've got the Sentry Tournament of Champions, all of the winners from last year on tour, everyone that made it to the Tour Championship, one of the best pound-for-pound fields you're going to see in all of golf, regardless of the level. And also a golf course here with Kapalua, the Plantation Course, that is almost a star of its own. So looking forward to breaking that down here. And like I said, getting back into the swing of things here. Going to be getting all of the content out there that we were posting in 2022, from course breakdowns, DFS previews, our live streams on Wednesdays, showdown content throughout the events. We're going to be there live for plenty of events this year as well, especially for the Florida swing, whether it's for the 3 or 4 tour events down here, potentially a few of the live events, a few of the events in like Georgia, South Carolina. We'll be there for the Tour Championship for sure. Really looking forward to 2023. So hoping to start it off with a blast here at the Tournament of Champions. And in this video specifically, going to cover everything you need to know about this week's track. From Kapalua, the golf course, its setup, some of the key stats that you'll need to keep an eye on for trying to identify your top plays of the week, and a few of the other golf courses that you may have seen around the PGA Tour that are really good comparisons to what you're going to get this week. So either way, if you're betting, if you're playing DFS, or if you're potentially even trying to play this golf course and trying to get an idea of what you need to know going into it, this video is going to be everything that you need. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get this thing rocking. The Tournament of Champions is a no-cut event, as a lot of you probably could imagine, with only 39 players teeing it up. You either have to be a winner or have made it all the way through the playoffs to the Tour Championship to be eligible to play in Maui. And boy, oh boy, is this a treat if you have the privilege to go out there and tee it up. It's one of the more pristine, one of the more scenic golf courses we have all year. I mean, some of the West Coast events like a Pebble Beach are certainly in that conversation, but we're in Maui, Hawaii, right? It's hard to beat that. I know for the next week we'll be at Sony, which is on the main island over there in Hawaii. But Maui, I've been over there a few times. I've been to the main island a few times as well. Maui, my personal favorite. It's one of the more scenic spots around the entire world. I've personally never been to this resort, this golf course, but hey, from everything I've seen on TV, it definitely lives up to all of the hype. So a few notes here. It's on Maui, like I said. It's a par 73. So that's the one real unique characteristic of this course. And you would expect there to be like 5, potentially even 6 par 5s on this sort of track, but there's only 4. So when we take a look at the breakdown here, it's a unique par 73 at that. It has 3 par 3s, so less than what you typically see at a par 72 or a par 70, and 11 par 4s. That means that there's only 4 par 5s on property, so well below what you'd expect for, like I said, you'd expect there to be 5, maybe 6 par 5s out of par 73 setup. But when you take a look at the hole-by-hole breakdown, not only are all the par 5s easily reachable by everyone in the field, you have a few drivable par 4s as well. So the scoring is absolutely outrageous at this event. I mean, when you take a look at the leaderboard last year, that's extremely evident. The winning score was 34 under par for Cam Smith. And second place was 33 under for Jon Rahm, so it wasn't like Cam Smith went out there and absolutely nuked the field. And in fact, third place, Matt Jones at 32 under par. So, I mean, if Matt Jones over there at Live now, obviously, can take this to 32 under par, you get an idea for just how much birdie production, how much risk reward is out there at Kapalua. So a few things to note: the scoring average last year was 4.78 strokes under par, so by far the easiest course on all of the PGA Tour. And outside of Cam Smith, a few of the recent champions at Kapalua include a Harris English, Justin Thomas, Xander Schauffele, Dustin Johnson, JT again, and Jordan Spieth back there 7 or 8 years ago. A few other things to note about the setup, just from a generalistic standpoint. There are 93 sand bunkers on property, so healthily above the tour average there. And like I said, 2 of the par 4s out there are going to be drivable at least most of the days for at least most of the field. In fact, there could be even potentially 3 drivable par 4s for some of the longer players out there, depending on the wind direction. When we take a look at some of the fairways, roughs, greens specifics at this golf course, you're going to see Bermuda from tip to toe. So whether it's the rough, fairways, whether it's your tee boxes or, of course, your greens, everything is going to be some sort of strain of Bermuda grass. The fairways are specifically a celebration Bermuda grass, and they are among the widest fairways that you're going to see on the PGA Tour. They average 46.6 yards per fairway, and that is a healthy 12 yards higher than average, 11.9 yards to be exact right there, which doesn't make them the widest that you'll see, but like I said, among the widest that you'll see on all the PGA Tour. And hole number 18 has a fairway nearly 120 yards wide. Now, the landing area for these Tour pros is something closer to like 30 or 40 yards, but if you absolutely had to hit a fairway on 18, let's say you're taking a 5-6 shot lead into that sort of hole, there are no excuses there. You can hit a 3-wood out there, a driving iron, that sort of thing, and literally have wider than a football field to land your shot. So fairway is going to be plentiful this week, and last year you saw the field do exactly that with an 80.9% driving accuracy across the board, which is a whole 14.9% higher than what you're seeing week to week. So plenty of fairways being hit. And when you aren't hitting fairways, it's worth noting that the missed fairway penalty was relatively high. It was 0.44 shots, which was a whole 0.06 more than usual. So despite this being a really easy golf course, when you did get out of position at Kapalua, players were penalized a little bit more than what you're used to seeing. Now, 0.06 shots per missed fairway isn't really all that drastic. I mean, if you're gaining a bunch of strokes off the tee with your distance, you're going to more than be able to make up for that 0.06 shot difference. But it's still worth noting that even at this sort of birdie fest, that you want to keep it at least relatively online. Now, the 46.6 yard wide fairways are almost hard to miss, especially for some of these Tour pros. But for somebody like a Jordan Spieth, a Justin Thomas comes to mind, these more bomb and gouge sort of players like a Cam Young come to mind. They might run into trouble from time to time. When you have all of that distance, when you're a little bit less accurate off the tee, you're a lot more prone into getting into some of that trouble. So that's something to keep an eye on. But the rough in general is also a celebration Bermuda grass, right around 1.5 inches long. That itself isn't that penal. It's more the natural areas that you can get into, those 93 bunkers around the property that add to that missed fairway penalty. When we take a look at the greens, they are again Bermuda grass. They are a Tiff Eagle Bermuda, a little bit different than the celebration that you have on the fairways and the rough. And they are among the largest greens that you're going to see on all the PGA Tour. Now, if you were to exclude St. Andrews last year, the old course where you have over 10,000 square foot greens, these would be your largest on the PGA Tour. So with what we're seeing year in and year out, these are as large as they're going to get. And they're also running at relatively slow speeds. Last year ran at 10.5 on the stimp meter. As of right now, the GCSAA, which is of course the Greenskeeper Association, they do all of the write-ups heading into these events. They talk about the superintendent. I always post the link to that report down in the description of these videos, which it'll be down there for this video as well, so make sure to check it out. They have it running at 11 right now per the superintendent. And from what I've heard, there's going to be some rain potentially on Tuesday. There's higher than a 50% chance of rain on Wednesday. That could potentially slow down a little bit as they get closer to lock. So we'll talk about the weather here in a second. Actually, in fact, right after we talk about the greens regulation, which were 84.4%, a whole 84% GIR percentage in 2022, which is 16.1% higher than what you're used to seeing on the PGA Tour. So with 8,700 square foot greens, with, we're talking about relatively benign conditions last year. There was almost no wind. It was extremely receptive last year. They had no problem hitting the greens. Again, that is among the elite of all of the elite on PGA Tour when it comes to GIR percentage. So with players hitting over 80% of fairways, almost 85% of greens, that's why they took it to 34 under par, right? They weren't getting out of position. Those elite tier players that were in contention were nearly perfect when it came to their ball striking. So that's why I saw the sort of scoring that happened there in 2022. But let's talk about the weather, which is the huge X factor when it comes to PGA DFS, betting, all things golf. Per the GCSAA, it has been a lot drier in the area over the recent months. You'll see that on the report if you bring it up in the description. The soil conditions are going to be conducive towards firm and fast conditions, per the superintendent there, but the area received more than 4 inches of rain over the last week. So that may be subject to change, particularly if it rains there on a Tuesday or a Wednesday this week. So make sure to keep an eye on the weather forecast. And on top of the moisture, you may see higher winds this time around. Last year, it was extremely benign. The winds didn't get higher than 10 to 15 miles an hour throughout the entire week. And if you see something closer to like 15 to 25 miles an hour, any sort of coastal golf course is going to get exponentially more difficult. And now, I'm not saying it's going to play over par, but it might play, let's say, 2.5 strokes under par, rather than the 4.5, 5 strokes under par that we consistently saw last year. So that's also something to keep an eye on there as well. And something to keep an eye on as well are the GAR percentages and the fairway percentages. The fairway percentages, if it's firm and fast, if we don't get that rain on Tuesday and Wednesday, the GAR percentages, same sort of story, are going to drastically go down. Last year, it was extremely moist, like I mentioned, which is going to lead to extremely receptive greens, but also extremely receptive fairways. They're extremely undulated fairways here at Kapalua, which is something we're going to talk about when we go hole by hole here in a second. But with some of that undulation is a lot of rollout. And when you have firm and fast undulating fairways, it's going to be almost impossible to hold them. Those undulations are going to take your ball off of the fairway, run into some of that rough, potentially into a few hazards around this sort of golf course. The 93 sandbuggers on property become even more of a problem when you get these firm and fast conditions. So like usual, when it comes to this PGA DFS stuff, this is also stuff we have to consider. If it ends up being drier this time around, you're going to see around the green be a lot more important. With all of that undulation comes tricky golf shots. And when you're hitting tricky shots around the green, the cream of the crop around the green players are going to have a huge advantage over the rest of the field, so on and so forth. And if it ends up raining on a Tuesday or Wednesday, well, we're probably going to see something similar to what we saw last year. So I always like to point that out. But as of right now, it does look like it should rain on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And if that happens, I do think it'll play similar to last year. But if that rain doesn't end up coming through, and again, we got to keep an eye on that, we could be in store for perhaps a little bit more of a difficult Tournament of Champions course. All right, so my favorite part of these breakdowns, going hole by hole to give you a taste of what these players are dealing with this week. So hole number 1, a 521-yard par 4. So not nearly the handshake that most players would be hoping for, but it's a little bit deceptive here. Your tee shot has right around a 20-yard drop, and then your shot from the fairway into the green is at least another 15 to perhaps 20-yard elevation drop as well. So while it's 521 yards on the scorecard, it's going to play closer to 470, perhaps even 460 yards depending on wind direction. So not nearly as difficult as perhaps you may have hoped, but if it's going to be firm and fast, you saw a few players last year towards the end of the tournament get towards the end of this fairway. It's extremely sloped here. It's something that you can't really appreciate on these overhead views, but there's a huge downslope from right around the bottom of the screen here upwards to this rough patch. So players ended up running through the fairway quite often. So don't be surprised if players end up laying up to the spot here in the fairway. Actually, where they have the marker here is right about the top of that hill. So if you end up laying back with a 3-wood off the tee, you're going to have, let's see, if I take this back a little bit, try to be a little bit more conservative, that leaves you 200 yards into the green. But remember, it's been around a 15 to 20 yard drop there. So in fact, yeah, you can see it's a 15-yard elevation change, 15-meter elevation change, so a little bit off right there from the fairway down to the green, so not nearly as difficult as your typical 200-yard shot. Hole number 2 is a par 3. It's 219 yards. It's a relatively flat hole, massive green, relatively straightforward. Not much to talk about there. Hole 3 is 426 yards, another relatively standard hole, and this one plays uphill. So your first shot's going to play right around 10 yards uphill. So it's going to play closer to like 440, perhaps 450 yards here. But another relatively straightforward iron shot, perhaps a little bit more difficult because it plays uphill, but another massive green, and it should be a birdie look for most of the field. Hole 4 is 421 yards, another uphill hole where you're going to see right around a 25-yard elevation change on your tee shot, and then your second shot in right around a 10-yard elevation change. So a little bit longer than the scorecard yardage there, probably playing closer to 450, perhaps even 460 yards. But again, not much to worry about from the hazards, a massive landing area, and around the green, it isn't even protected very well. It's just an oblong green with green side bunkers, but well out of the way. Hole number 5 is your first par 5. It is only 531 yards, but yet again is going to play uphill. So your tee shot plays about 20 yards uphill. That fairway bunker is going to be in play for these tour pros. It's right around a 290 yard carry off the tee. Uphill, probably playing closer to 310, perhaps 320 yards. But for your Jon Rahms of the world, your Rory McIlroys at this sort of event, they would be getting into trouble in this bunker. But you and me, we're going to be a lot further back, most likely laying up here. But if you can get the ball in the fairway, for most of these players, you're looking at right around, let's give you an exact yardage here. I'd say right around 200 yards. Yeah, 220 yards to the center of the green. The front edge is going to be right around 200 yard carry. You're going to see plenty of eagle looks here at hole number 5, and a majority, I'd say at least 65, probably 70% of the field getting home with a birdie. Hole 6 is 424 yards, but unlike some of the other shorter par 4s on the front, this one plays downhill, so this is potentially drivable. If it ends up being firm and fast this time around, you're going to see players take a hack at this green because first off, it's a 330 yard carry to this spot right here where the downslope starts. So again, you can't really appreciate some of the elevation changes on these overhead views, but all of the landscape here funnels from right around my marker here down to the hole. So if it's firm and fast, you got to think 330 yards isn't all that difficult for tour pros when it's playing 23 yards downhill and potentially could get it up there near the green. Dustin Johnson hit it up there on the green a few times. I think Jon Rahms got it up there a few times as well. A lot of it comes down to wind direction and, like I said, most importantly, how firm and fast it's going to play. Hole 7 is a long par 4, but another one that's playing downhill, so not nearly as long as the 523 yards would indicate. It's not going to be drivable like last hole, but another hole where you can very easily see drives of upwards of 350 yards. So they have it set right now at just 303. Most of these tour pros are going to get it out there to 350, perhaps even 360 yards, leaving you right around 160 yards into the green with yet again another huge elevation change, right around 15 yards there from your fairway into the green, making it pretty much a wedge for all of these sort of players. So again, the downhill holes tend to be the longer holes on property, and the holes that are playing uphill tend to be the ones that are a little bit shorter to counteract that. So a great setup by Kapalua, and pretty much every single hole is a birdie hole. I mean, they set it up perfectly for the landscape. Hole 8 is right around 200 yards. It could play anywhere between 175 and 220, depending on where they put the pin location, perhaps moving around the tee box as well. But another straightforward par 3, and not much going on with the par 3s here. They're the most straightforward holes. The par 4s and 5s have a little bit more character to them. Hole number 9 is your last par 5 on the front. It is 549 yards, and you're looking at one of the flatter holes on property. So it's going to play right around that actual distance, and every single player in the field should reach this into, or at least be right around pin high into. You're going to see plenty of eagle looks. I'd expect pretty much every single player to get out of there with the birdie. So expect to see this hole play pretty much right around a stroke under par. Hole number 10 is 390 yards, so it would make a little bit more sense, in my opinion, to use this as hole number 1, but hey, the course architect designers decided otherwise, so we'll deal with it. But 390 yards, a lot more of a handshake than what you see for hole number 1, and you're looking at a 3-wood, perhaps a driver if you want to be a little bit more aggressive down there, and a wedge at the very most into this green. Hole 11 is 168 yards, so an extremely short par 3, and it does play downhill as well. So an effective yardage of right around 150 yards to the front, right around 170 yards to the back. Pretty much an 8 iron at the very most likely a pitching wedge for most of these tour players, and a hole that you're definitely looking to make a birdie on. Hole 12 is 424 yards. This is a relatively flat hole here, as most of the holes on the back 9 are. Hole 12, though, it's 424. It's a driver, perhaps even a 3-wood off the tee, and then another wedge in. So just another scoring opportunity. And you can probably see by the scoring average was nearly 5 strokes under par. All of these par 5s, more than reachable into, and pretty much all these par 4s, you're looking at like an 8-9 iron on a majority of them, and the longest tee shots that you're going to have are going to be on the par 3s. Hole 13 is 385 yards. It's another relatively flat hole, but it does play slightly uphill here. So it plays slightly longer than the 400-yard yardage. You're not going to see anybody taking a crack at this off the tee, but it's another driver, 3-wood off the tee, and then a wedge in. So a relatively straightforward birdie look. I'm getting tired of saying that at this point, but hole 14 changes it up a little bit. It is a 306-yard drivable par 4. Now it plays uphill, so it plays closer to like 310, 320 yards, but if anything, that is advantageous for these tour players. When you give them like a 280, 290 yard par 4, that's when it's a little bit tricky. That's what you have for hole number 10 at Riviera, where it's in between a driver and a 3-wood for pretty much every single player. And unless you're one of the really short guys that can hit a driver and get it to land like 270, 280 yards, or if you're somebody that's one of the massively long players that might be able to get a 3-wood there, 290 yards, it's a tough hole to play. So when you get it at right around, 310, 320 yards, that's the sweet spot, because these tour players that are maybe a little bit shorter are going to have a 10, 20 yard chip onto the green. They're going to be in one of these greenside bunkers most likely, or the longer players on tour might be able to get it up onto this surface. So it could see a few eagles at hole number 14, but more than anything, going to be at least right around a 0.6, 0.7 undershot average. Hole 15 is your par 5, so it's 548 yards, reachable in 2 by the entire field, also relatively flat in terms of your elevation. I want to go back here to take a look at the green complex, which is pretty much undefended. There's a few bunkers out here that are in that 40 to 50 yard range, which you want to avoid at all costs. But around the green, you're talking about your typical just little shaved off chipping areas around the green, going to be one of the easier holes on property. Hole 16 is 375 yards. Again, slightly plays uphill, so it's not really drivable in that sense, but it's another one of those driver wedge holes where you're looking to, at the very least, have a 10 to 15 foot birdie putt. Hole 17 is a relatively long par 4, but it plays massively downhill. So your tee shot plays 30 yards downhill. You could see guys getting it down here to the slope here. Plenty of guys, especially towards the left side here, where there's even more slope, are going to get it down here to, let's say, 390. I mean, yeah, I forget. Last year, I think it was Dustin Johnson. Perhaps it was Bryson DeChambeau playing at this event that had something like a 390, 400-yard drive. If you do that, it's a relatively straightforward hole. Now, if you hit something like a 3-wood off the tee, you're trying to be a little bit more conservative, just play the downslope, get it to roll out, to its natural distance. You're probably still looking at a 200-yard shot into the green, but it's, again, playing right around 20, 30 yards downhill. So it's not nearly as tricky as you may think. You had a few players last year that mishit shots because of the slope of the fairway into this gorge over here, and absolutely, just lose their hat here on hole number 17. So you have to focus up. You have to make sure that you hit the ball properly, solid contact over that natural area, but not nearly as difficult if you can do so. Hole 18 looks like one of the longest holes in the world, right? It's 669 yards, but this fairway has a little bit of a trick to it. You're going to see players that you can see they have it set at 330, and that's for me and you out there, right? The average player there. There's going to be tour players, guys, and you saw this last year. The longest drives on the PGA Tour all happened on this hole. Hole 17, almost all of the number 5 through 10 drives last year on tour happened in hole 17. Hole 18, though, is where the mother load happens. You're going to see 400-yard drives. Ooh, we got to get it to go back there. My apologies. There we go. So you're going to see guys drive it down here on this left side, because not only does the fairway slope from tee box down to the fairway, it also slopes from right to left. So all of your drives here, if you can get one moving with draw spin down the slope, you can get it to the 400-yard zone. And that's going to leave you with pretty much nothing into this green. You can see if I set your second marker on the center of the green, you're looking at a 243-yard shot with a 20-yard elevation change. So you're looking at an iron, probably something like a 6, maybe a 7 iron for some of the longer players on tour. So a hole that's 670 yards on paper that could play as short as 520 yards, right? A lot more reasonable than a lot of people are expecting. So the tee shot here is the vital part. If you end up hitting a fade or losing it on the right side, you could lose up to 150 yards of distance. I mean, you could legitimately end up over here losing 100 yards if you just hit that fade. If you end up missing the fairway entirely, you could end up over here, right? And you can end up losing 120 yards of distance, having something like 300 and let's see there, 29 yards into the green, and that's accounting for the elevation change. So clearly you'd have to lay up at that point. You want to be able to go for the green into. It's a great risk reward hole to end an extremely scenic golf course. All right, now that we've seen the golf course and we have an idea for some of the shots required around the Plantation Course, let's go through our key metrics for analysis to give you an idea of some of the stats to keep an eye on. You're trying to identify your top plays, which is by far the most important part of this video. So at number 1, we've got shots gained approach, which is 90% of the time going to be our number 1 stat. So no surprise there. But the one key thing to really touch on here would be the buckets, right? A lot of your iron shots here are either going to be wedges, something that an 100 to maybe 125 yard range, that 125 to 150 yard range, or long iron shots, 200 plus yard iron shots. That mid-tier range where you're going from 150 to perhaps that 200 yard bucket is going to be extremely underutilized. And when you take a look at the buckets on Data Golf, that is reflected in the stats. So when we're trying to take a look at iron play, perhaps keep that in mind. If you have a wedge specialist, they're going to have a few holes here where they should really be able to take advantage of it. If somebody is an exceptional long iron player, they are going to be able to take apart those long par 5s, those par 3s that were a little bit longer than usual on the PGA Tour. So those are a few of the things that I'm personally going to keep an eye on. And it's not something that you can look at under a microscope, right? When you're looking at these buckets, you have to use them as just a little bit of a nudge in a player's direction, because there tends to be a lot of variance with bucket stats. That's why I tend to look at year-to-year basis when it comes to those sort of buckets. So for me, I'm looking at 2022. If somebody is really popping in the wedge range, long iron range, or ideally both of those ranges, they're going to be somebody I'm considering a little bit more this week than most. At number 2, we've got driving distance, which at a nearly 7,600 yard golf course shouldn't be a surprise to many people out there. You have a lot of slopes that you can run it down, a few speed slots, as some people may call them, for some of those longer players on tour. So you're going to see a distinct advantage there. The par 3s are a lot easier for some of the longer players. And of course, in general, driving distance is heavily correlated to success on the PGA Tour. So not a huge surprise, but definitely something we don't always see up there in the top 3. And at number 3, speaking of number 3, we've got shots gained putting on Bermuda grass. Approach play, putting, 90% of the time are going to always be up there in the top 3. So not a surprise, but we have a pure Bermuda course. So whether it's around the green, on the greens, we want to be looking at that specific grass type for some of the correlations, some of the stats that we're pulling in our models. And specifically at this event, because it's a birdie fest, we had a winning score of 34 under par. We know that our outright winners, some of those top end DFS performers for large field GBPs, if we're looking for a ceiling performance, are going to have to be an elite putter on Bermuda. I mean, John Rahm, Bermuda is one of his better surfaces. Cam Smith is the best Bermuda putter world, potentially of all time, at least from when stats are being kept, right? He's probably the best Bermuda putter of all time. So not really a surprise that those two ended up bringing it home last year. And Matt Jones, he's, only killed the Honda Classic over the few years, another extremely grainy Bermuda course. So definitely something that I'll be looking at this time around. A few other key stats that I'm considering would be par 5 scoring, though there's only 4 on property. Was kind of hoping it would be 5 or 6 given it's a par 73. A lot of your scoring comes on those holes. A lot of the eagles and ceiling performances come from taking apart those par 5s. So I'm looking at that. Shots gained at no-cut events, because there's an art form to it. You can be a little bit more aggressive at a no-cut event. Players like Xander Schauffele really get that idea. Justin Thomas, also the sort of player that's had a lot of success at this sort of event over the years. So something I have in my model. Birdie or better percentage, another way to look at aggressive players. Shots gained around the green on Bermuda. So much like the putting, I'm looking at around the green numbers on Bermuda grass. And the rest of the key stats are on my Patreon page as well. It's not limited to that. But let's go ahead and get into the comp courses here. Our first comp course is going to be the most iconic course in the world, Augusta National, home of the Masters. And really, it's a perfect comp. It comes down to the undulation. It comes down to the creativity required to hit golf shots around Augusta National. It's that same sort of thing you see at Kapalua. Those elevation changes from fairways down to greens, from tee boxes down to fairways even, can be extremely difficult to navigate. There's an art form to knowing how much to club down when you're hitting downhill, how much to club up when you're hitting uphill, so on and so forth. And players that have that ability have had a lot of crossover success. I mean, a Jordan Spieth, right? Winner at this event, also at the tournament, at the Masters. You also have Patrick Reed, right? Masters champion, a champion at this event the year before Jordan Spieth was able to win. A lot of the champions over the years, a DJ has won both events. A lot of guys that have finished in the top 5 at the Masters have also finished at the top 5 at the Tournament of Champions. A lot of crossover to be had. So whether it's the greens, the creativity, the undulation, the elevation changes that you see around both golf courses, the stat crossover as well. If you take a look at Data Golf and you look at their #1 correlated course, it's Augusta National. So it checks every single box that we're looking for, and definitely the course I'm looking at the most this week. Number 2, though, is Riviera Country Club, a course that I comp pretty closely to Augusta National, so not a huge surprise there. The greens, specifically the fairways at Riviera, have a lot of undulation to them, so you have tricky lies. The greens are among the most tricky in the world. In fact, I'd say they're even more tricky than Augusta National at times. You have donut bunkers in the middle of greens at Riviera. A lot of the around the green test, a lot of the creativity, like I mentioned, is just apparent at that golf course. So not a surprise that those two courses are at the top of this list. And at number 3, this is more from the ball striking perspective, is Torrey Pines North. So the main course that they use for the Farmers Insurance Open, where they play 3 of the 4 rounds for that event. You have a massive emphasis on driving distance because it's among the longest courses that you have in all of the PGA Tour. And while this course, because it's a par 73, may not be nearly as long as, something like a Torrey Pines North, a lot of the players that have also had success at Torrey Pines, you've seen have success at the Tournament of Champions too. So kind of like Augusta National, a lot of crossover from that perspective. And you also have quite a bit of undulation on the greens, kind of similar to a Riviera and an Augusta. Tricky greens that require a lot of creativity, whether you're putting or around the green on them, makes it something that I'm looking at from the stat perspective. But much like the rest of my key stats, the rest of the comps that I'm using are going to be on the Patreon page, so make sure to check those on out as well. All right, fellas, that is all for the first piece of content here in 2023. I am super excited for the Sentry Tournament of Champions, and we'll have even more content dropping later on today and throughout the week. So keep an eye for my core picks video, which will be dropping for PGA DFS this week. On there, I touch on my top 6 plays for GPP contest. And this week, because it's a condensed field, it is just going to be my top 4 plays. But on there, going to give you an idea of the top 4 players that I'll be using in my player pool. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of that content when it drops. But we'll have value picks dropping. We'll have our DFS live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of that as well. And hey, before you hop on out of here, go ahead and hit that like button too, right? If you enjoy this content, you use it for your research process, go ahead and give back a little bit. Help me grow the channel here with the like button. But like always, guys, I appreciate all the support here. If you guys have a take on the winning score, go ahead and comment that down below. I think that the winning score of 34 under par might be hard to topple this year. I think something closer to like 28, potentially like 30 under par probably gets it done this time around. But much like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, a lot of it comes down to the weather. If we end up getting firm and fast conditions, I'd probably take the under there at 30 under par, where I'd think someone like maybe like 25 to 28 under par wins. And I guess that's a hard one, right? Is under like further under par, or is it just like a lower number in terms of under par? You guys get the point. That's a debate to be had at another point. But go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the winning score down below, and perhaps what you think that winning score is going to be. But like I said, guys, until next time, best of luck with all of your bets, any DFS lineups that you decide to play this week, and let's make 2023 a good one.